Thank you. Welcome everybody to this talk, How to Avoid a Curse to Everlasting Generations. What was meant by this quote is that in the story of, by the way, has someone of you read the Frankenstein story, not just see the movie? It's, as often the case, way more sophisticated and interesting than the movie. But anyway, for those that haven't read it, it's about a scientist, and he's now in front of this question whether he should do something which might become a huge burden for maybe everlasting, forever generations. So, do we have a framework within which created risks, technologically created risks, are adequately managed? And if not, what does that mean for the creators of technology? The talk will be divided up into three parts. We'll first look at some basic aspects of our technological development, then look at how these aspects affect in our time, and then we'll look at how we can deal, or what would need to be done if we wanted to deal with the root causes. So first, some basic aspects. Those will be three aspects. I'll first look at technological development as such, then at the phenomena of lagging handling capacity and negative effects. So first, technological development. You've all seen this curve surely many times, also in different kinds of contexts. What it is obviously about is that we are going through an exponential increase, not just in number of our technologies, but also in their complexity, which is interesting enough also quite similar to biological evolution, where the highest level, not all technologies are becoming more complex, hammer and nail, for instance, but also in biology, not all life forms are becoming more complex, but the highest level of complexity has also been increasing over its evolution. So we come from hunter-gatherer societies, all of us. Some of us transition into agrarian societies, then the so-called first advanced civilizations, then a bit of a time leap into the Renaissance, scientific revolution, industrialization. And the reason, I know you know this, the reason I'm telling you this, putting it in a slightly different visual context, our species is still a baby compared to other species. We're really very young. We're, quote-unquote, only 300,000 years old. Our genus is 3 million years old. And if I would have continued this graph over the course of our genus's history, it would have, of course, this is a slight exaggeration, but in principle looked just a lot more the same, just flat line. And then that's actually already really generous take to include the transition to agrarian societies. It really only took off, as you know, with industrialization, and then again actually after World War II. So why I'm showing you this is, in our time, it's so easy to think that what we are experiencing is some sort of a normalcy, which it is for us individually, and also one could say for a few generations even, this constant, almost like a background noise of technological innovation. But it's a bit the curse of our time to just be in this bubble of our own lives in our own time. If we zoom out a little bit, look at the history of our species, and then certainly the history of our genus, we see that we live in completely extraordinary times. Absolutely no comparison whatsoever throughout our human history. And that alone, actually, I think, should be reason enough to suspect that we're going to have a hard time dealing with something that is so completely out of the ordinary. Because what has stayed the same is us. Our difference genetically from human beings 10,000 years ago is completely neglectable. So, next point is the phenomenon of lagging handling capacity. Actually, it's quite obvious. You introduce a technology, you don't know the technology yet. The yellow horizontal line is perfect management of technology. And once you introduce the technology, you have to get to know the technology. You have to get to know how it affects its environment, its natural environment, or what the effects are eventually in regards to natural environment, our social realm, and so on. So there's a learning curve. We will never reach perfect management of a technology because we never have perfect information, perfect foresight, which negative effects are very much related to. I just said we do not have perfect information, and therefore we do not have perfect foresight. So that means that the effects of technology use are not perfectly foreseeable and controllable. Or in other words, negative effects are, we could always say, an inevitable part of technology use. So, what does this mean? It means that the challenge or the point of this discussion cannot be about completely avoiding negative effects. That is not possible. It's about minimizing the amount and severity of these negative effects. Because, just to be complete, our well-being and the well-being of other life forms and the natural environments that we share with them depends on it. It's not just l'art pour l'art. So let's look at these three basics in our time. Again, this graph, exponential increasing technological development, the number and complexity of our technologies. And of course, we're not just talking in regards to lagging handling capacity. We're not just talking about one technology. We're talking about all of our technologies. And just as, I guess, as obvious, what we learn about the world and about materials and so on is knowledge. It's not just available for technology as such. It's also available to manage, to understand, to learn about that technology. So our handling capacity also increases. But kind of like as a mirror image to the number and complexity, the growing number and complexities of our technologies, there is a growing number and complexity of negative effects as well. I mean, if you just think about the negative effects that we know that our ancestors from, say, 15,000 years ago affected with their hunting technology, hunting tools, we know at the very least they contributed to the extinction of the megafauna. So there always were negative effects. But if you compare that, say, with global warming and all those effects that trickle down from there on, then we, I think, can easily see that there's no comparison in complexity and consequence. In other words, we can say there's a growing gap between what we are capable of inventing and what we're capable of handling. The evidence for this, it's not so important that you can read. These are various areas, some concern apparently technology per se with telecommunications, which of course connect back into our natural environment, the materials used, the energy that is required, discard devices, I'll get to that in the next slide, world population growth, which is really one of the key problematic effects of our technological development, because through our technologies we enabled more calories and better health, which then contributed to the ripping apart of fertility and mortality rates. This is a problem that is likely to peak towards the end of this century. And many of these then as well, in consequence, at least of this problem. Here are issues that are closer to home for you guys in computer sciences. You know, we have problems in the social realm, the echo chambers, polarization, also in regards to political developments and what that might mean. We know in America that it is not by far, certainly not the only reason, but it is also a contributing factor in the unsteadiness and shakiness of that democracy, which, Drop in empathy, loneliness, these are things that are now also becoming systematically researched. Bioinformatics, huge ethical questions that we don't even have a societal consensus yet, how we should go about, what they mean, these discussions yet science and industry are pressing forward. Nevertheless, we have political and economic power concentrations that are a problem in open democratic societies because of, for instance, data collection and analysis and use of those results. We have autonomous weapon systems that are certainly no longer a thing of the past. Who knows how that will pan out. And of course, with all of this, we have mountain energy resource needs and discarded devices I mentioned before. That's what I meant by problems that are not connected to our ecology. The first top four are problems that will continue to develop regardless whether or not we've reached peak population at the end of the century. So now we can be a bit more specific. These three aspects have been around ever since there have been human beings. Now we can see that we live in extraordinary, very, very fast and broad meaning that many innovations are going on simultaneously. We live in times of very fast and broad technological development with an increasingly lagging handling capacity and therefore more and increasingly complex negative effects. And of course, these three aspects are causally connected. So the opening question was, do we have a framework within which the created risks are adequately dealt with? And based on what I was saying, I think the answer has to be no. We do not have an adequate framework, because if we did, we would not be dealing with this amount and severity of negative effects. So I'd like to pause before I start the third part, because I know I threw a lot at you, and I'd be really interested, and you're most welcome to also address, to speak amongst yourself. It doesn't have to be all through me. But what do you think? It can be very spontaneous. It doesn't have to be a thought out. It could be a spontaneous reaction to what I've said, or what your reaction is to the things I've said. Yes, please.
So spontaneously.
Yes.
You only spoke about the negative effects when talking about the gaps. You didn't speak about the positive effects and the gap between positive effects and negative effects.
Yeah.
Is this gap increasing also?
Well, that's probably something that would be very difficult to assess, because there's a lot of personal opinion in it.
Also have negative effects is a lot of personal opinion. Why not also putting everything in the balance?
Yeah.
The positive effects.
It's a good point. So I'll address first the balance, what you said last, and then what I mean by personal opinion. Because ultimately, I personally do not think it's a personal opinion, but I'll get to it. So balance, I sort of assume, but I think you're right, and I should have mentioned it, but I sort of assume I'd be like preaching to the choir if it had to emphasize the technologies in the development also have substantial positive sides. It's kind of, it goes without saying, because why else would we devote so much time and energy and resources? But I agree, it should be mentioned as well. What I think, however, is, because that's what you addressed, the difference between positive sides and negative sides. How should I put this? I think if we, as now, creating existential environmental problems, I think that comment alone kind of puts it into perspective. What good is a combustion engine if we destroy the basis of our lives and those of countless other species as well? For me, that's not even a question anymore. I mean, yeah. No, but do you think it's worth, like, you think climate warming, for instance, is worth all this damage it is, and we're just at the beginning of this story?
To be honest, I don't have an opinion, to be very honest.
I'm sorry?
To be honest, I don't have an opinion about that.
Yeah.
Because to be honest, I don't see the clear consequences, or I personally don't see that so clear.
Have you personally experienced a climate change effect?
To say is that I want to consider me part of nature, not above nature or taking care of nature, you know. And other animals also have negative effects in environments, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't treat us as negative; we treat us as nature.
Mm-hmm.
This was my point.
Okay.
I think it's a little bit, and don't understand me wrong. I'm not talking about you.
Yeah.
Speaking, considering human ship something apart from nature. As you said, we are species, and we are in nature. So everything we do is nature per definition.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. In a theoretical sense, I agree. But in the end, that's already, you're already, in the end, the problems that we're creating have their own reality, you know, and regardless whether, and I completely agree, we are absolutely part and expression of nature, I agree. And in that sense, you could also say everything that's happening is an expression, lastly, of nature, biological evolution. But where does that leave us? Because then you still have to have an opinion whether you feel it's as simplistic as it sounds. Is it good or bad? How bad is it? And are we going to do something about it? It still leaves you with those questions. Yes, I think there were some other remarks. Yes, please.
Isn't there a sort of dilemma if we, for example, try to solve a problem by developing technology, but by developing technology we could maybe increase other problems? Kind of, should we stop developing technology to not create more problems? or can we solve some problems by developing technology?
Well, theoretically, just theoretically, based on the way I understand the problem, it would be great if we could hit pause. Because there's so many issues that we are not even nearly close enough on top of. So hitting pause, if it were theoretically possible, would be an awesome thing. Not like the PR stunt that Elon Musk pulled off a couple of months ago with a pause of half a year in AI. That's ridiculous. I mean, we would probably realistically talk about a pause of several generations, you know. But technology and its development is part of our human DNA, almost, so to speak. I mean, not even just, as I pointed out, since we are humans, but our entire genus has always had tool use. So it would be negating who we are if you'd say, this is it, we're not going to develop technology at all anymore. So no, we definitely need to in the long run, and just because it's who we are. But what you pointed out about new sets of tools or technologies, or entirely new technological areas like genetic engineering, they will. That's a given. They will create their own sets of problems. That's not even a question. The question is, how well can we deal with it? And I would say, just as in sports, if you are more or less if you slept well and are relaxed, well, recreated, then you'll perform a lot better compared to if you're already completely tired and sore muscles and so on. And we are like already really tired. Our resources are really spread very thinly in regards to dealing with these issues. So, yeah. Yes?
So this is like more a question of regulations and supervision on top of these creators' technology. Also, the question is, where does the biggest change come from? Is it from the private sector, from some individuals which are difficult to supervise, or should we have more courses of ethical concerns in universities? Yeah, what would be the future from your point of view? How should we approach this?
Regulations, I think, to some degree, in a sense of societal consensus put into word. There will be a need for that to some degree. I agree. I see it that way as well. But I think this is too big to be dealt with regulations. What it eventually will have to boil down to is a cultural change. Because, I mean, even if all of us were perfectly in agreement, we can't go against this entire phenomenon, which is obviously not just in Switzerland, it's worldwide. And as I pointed out, it has in a very broad sense, a 3 million year history in its back. So, I mean, if we think about it, it's quite crazy. Out of a very limited set of elements, you have a direct causal connection to this discussion right now, you know? And now what we are, should kind of reflect back on itself and see what it has been doing for 3 million years and understand that the way it has been going about for 3 million years, and I'll get to that, might not be working anymore. It's not about whether or not we should use technology or whether or not we should develop technology. It's about whether the way we've done it so far is still a good recipe for the future. Yes? Well, you know, astronomers have been musing about that question too, and they have, like, I think that the Drake equation, where this person, I think he's a physicist, I'm not sure what he was, but anyway, he tried to just some way semi-systematically assess the probability of life in different parts of the universe, and that was also one factor, the probability of a technological civilization being able to get out of this exponential increase at some point in order, as you said, not to destroy it. I don't know. Nobody knows. But I think, from my personal point of view, there's so much at stake and so many amazing, beautiful things. Also, our human being, I count that as part of being beautiful and amazing. And it is in danger of being diluted. We all know that. So I think there's so much at stake that I think is valuable that it's totally worth it to try and address this problem, try to deal with these things better. And if in 300-400 years human beings say, oh, we've tried it for 400 years and it doesn't work, that's then up to them, and I could understand their feeling of frustration. But we're at a point of this problem where we first have to actually acknowledge that there is a basic problem, that climate change or deforestation or species extinction or privacy issues and so on are the symptoms, and they're not the root causes of the problem. And if we negate the root problems, we just create ever more of these symptoms, and at some point it will completely explode our managerial capabilities. And then we'll have that which you said. Yes. Well, the way I unfortunately see it is that you can only get so far with a rationalization of the problem. I think being at a technical school or being at a university, or you already defined yourself as being part of the population that is open to rationalization. And you don't have to be here to be open. I know enough people that have never gone to university and very much open to this kind of thinking. But I think the vast majority of the population, the way I see it, is not as inclined as perhaps we are. So different things will be a lever, as you said. And unfortunately, I think it will be unpleasant. Yeah, I mean, that's, it's human, it's the same with a child. You can tell the child, don't touch this, it's hot, don't be careful with that, it's sharp. But most children will have to make their own experiences, and that's the way, for better or for worse, that's the way we are. And unfortunately, I think, and that's the kind of like the sad or almost perverse aspect, those still, it's a lot less like that as it was, say, 200 years ago, but still those that are driving this the most are those that tend to be the most protected. So that's a bit of a conundrum, a bit. But I think the worse things are going to get, unfortunately, the more that will be water on the mill of looking at the basics. Was that more or less answer? Yeah, that's why, personally, I mean, based on what I know about very difficult human catastrophic situations, I personally do not want to live in a time like that. I prefer not to live in a time like that. But in regards to our entire human situation, the earlier this happens, the better, because the longer it takes for that to happen, the more entrenched everything will become, and the bigger problems we will have created. Yes?
For what's happening on the creators, because if someone doesn't create it, perhaps someone else will create it, and so progress will always be made. So wouldn't it be the more important question be how do we shape society so that the way technology is implemented is different than how it is now?
I mean, I certainly very much agree that it's not just the responsibility of the creators of technology. This is a multifaceted phenomenon. Also, governments and their politics, and I mean, we are now sitting in an institution that is heavily funded by society, you could say. And yes, I think that even beyond technology, as a consumer, every purchase you make is kind of like a vote. Where your money goes is what you support, is what you give more momentum. So yes, I very much agree that our society at large is also definitely called to react upon all this. But I also do think that those that are closest to it, know it the best, create new kinds of technologies, even new technology areas. They do have a heightened responsibility because, well, they do make it, yeah.
Do you have I mean, obviously you don't have to because it's a very complex question, but do you have a suggestion on how the way that our current system works, how that could be changed so that new technologies would actually be for the benefit of everyone, for most people first, and not for big companies to first, basically?
Yeah. Well, that's a big question. I would just like to suggest the following. What I've presented so far, I am, how should I say, I'm pretty confident that there's enough informational basis to say that this is fairly objective. The next part, what I'm going to show, are my personal conclusions based on these these previous two parts, and then you'll, I think, understand better what I mean. So now I'm just deducing from what I've said before. So what is it kind of like goes a bit into your question, what is our culture's approach to these problems? And essentially, we could deal with the symptoms, or we could deal with the root causes. And ideally, I think quite obviously also, ideally we would try to address both root causes and the symptoms. And the analogy that came to my mind is this kid who regularly or almost always eats too fast and swallows too big food pieces. And the symptoms are coughing, choking, difficulty of breathing. So in the image of our current technology culture, we would be fighting symptoms. MedTech industry might create an alternative pathway. The food industry might invent foods that dissolve quicker or are very slimy, that go down easier. Or robotics might invent a robot that follows the girl around and can perform a Heimlich maneuver whenever necessary. But actually, if you would try to solve this problem based on the root causes, you would teach that girl to eat slower and to bite off chunks that it could swallow more easily. Obviously, it's a very similar analogy to our situation because that's exactly what I think. We need to slow down and we need to create new technological complexities at a pace where we are more or less, as I said, there will always be negative effects, but where we have a better chance to keep on top of things. So treating symptoms alone will not improve the basic problem, which is the speed, amount, and complexity of our technological development, which is not sustainable. If it were more or less sustainable, we would not be creating the problems that we are creating. So, and another issue is that we're not looking at a gap that is too big, the gap between what we're capable of inventing and capable of managing, but this gap, as shown by the two different rates, exponential rates, is actually increasing. So there's a bit of a time issue here. We should have a sense of urgency, that's what I mean. So to narrow the gap, I think we need a change of mind. And we need to see that to invent what we can and apply it if it gives us an advantage, that approach needs to become a thing of the past. It has worked up until fairly recently. It has worked amazingly well in many areas, in many ways. But I think we're at a time where we can see more and more clearly that this approach is becoming too destructive. Secondly, we need to take speed out of our development, and we need to be much more selective in regards to that which we apply. So how close we are to industry, that's a speed booster. And by we, I mean at schools like the ETH. Just one idea. So I'll go through this very quickly because we're running out of time. We need to focus more on a better understanding and management of existing technology to refrain as well as possible from new technology areas for now, not in a future where we can say we are more or less on top of things again. As little tech as possible and as much as necessary. is the technological solution that might work, is it really the only way to solve that problem? Is technology really the only way to solve the problem? Maybe there's a completely non-technological way. Healthcare, I think there's a huge, from my point of view, irrational rush into technologies, especially when it concerns human-to-human interaction, and become far more selective to technology that strengthens choice, self-determination, freedom. I could have chosen other words. This is in regards to those examples of problematic areas like social media or data collection analysis that I used before. That's why I mentioned these: choice, self-determination, and freedom. So we might have a few more minutes. I'm done. You know the famous London Tube system sign, mind the gap. I would add on top of this, for this problem, we also need to narrow the gap. Thank you. Maybe we have a few more minutes. Yeah, we have 9 more minutes. Is that correct?
Correct.
Good.
We have 9 more minutes, so you could use this for Q&A time, or you could use this to expand upon your points.
No. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I sense that you were in disagreement with something I was saying before. If you want, I'd be very interested to do. You don't want to share?
I don't think we have enough time to discuss.
Okay. Yes?
First, a positive point. I really like the graph where you went 3,000 years behind, because it's very seldom to see that in any exposition, in any topic, that they zoom out and there is we are now in a very specific time. I like that very much. My second comment is, when you talk about the root causes, I have the feeling here, the root cause here is not the technology. The root problem is the human behavior. I think if you want, I can see the technology, the problem of all what you describe here.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the use of the technology, which is human behavior, which for me is something totally different. Just to put it on the table. And the last thing, when you talk about being as slow as possible, I smile because I would give 2 examples. And then if everybody honestly says, I would go as low as possible. For example, imagine I say, with this technology that I have to develop, I could solve the CO2 concentration in the air. Probably you would go as fast as possible with this technology, right? Or if you have a son or a family member that is dying because of an illness, and you know there is investigation going on, who would not want to be as fast as possible for developing the technology for that? Right?
And I very much see these 2 comments of yours being connected, because that's human behavior. And so this is a bit the question. It almost, in a way, goes back to the Big Bang. You know what I said before, that from the first organization of matter to this discussion now, there's one causal connection. Where do you start labeling something as causal? And I completely agree. Of course, who we are as human beings is part of the problem, but a little bit like what you were saying, I had to, for this person, narrow it down. I mean, it's a huge topic. And maybe some of you saw that I working on a farm, and I see something very similar that goes a bit more into what you were saying. I see how, on different farms, I see how animals behave. A cow, a pig, a chicken in their behavior is not always the same. It depends into which framework you have these animals. So when you have a framework that is not good for their well-being, they become impatient, aggressive, or even violent. You have to be very careful with cows that are not in an environment that's healthy for them. If you have them in an environment that is good for their health, for their well-being, they have healthy social interaction, cows are the most peaceful beings you can imagine. And we human beings are the same way. We're not set in a certain way. What comes out of us depends on the framework. So we're back to the framework of our modern societies, of our views of technology, how technology is also bringing, and the way we use it now is bringing certain sides of us to the forefront, and other sides of us that are still here is perhaps pushing back or lowering. So I basically absolutely agree. Though I think we should not focus on changing human beings because we are who we are. We should change the framework within which we are. Does that make sense?
Nice comment. I see you have a big advantage. People who believe that have a very easy way to go. Use technology as less as possible. As you said, you're voting with your body. Yeah? Don't use the lights, don't use microphone, don't use the bus to come here. You know, people that really think this, I don't, yeah, you have a choice as a person, as you
Yeah.
said, not using technology. When you are, don't use X-ray, don't use a plane, and then.
I understand. It's very difficult. I understand. But that's what I mean by cultural transition. And it goes without saying, exactly because it's such an old relationship, that this is not going to happen from today to tomorrow. This is a huge project, and the first step is to acknowledge that the problems probably go deeper than just climate change or ocean acidification and so on, or privacy, that there's something more fundamental, and if we don't address this fundamental, we'll just be caught in that loop and likely to steer towards what both women actually were saying before. Yes?
So you said that we have to be more selective of which technology we want to keep evolving, but as the negative effects become more and more complex, to the point that no one really understands the bad implication that technology may have, how can we get selective about that?
Okay. Take, for instance, genetic engineering. Right now, the framework is that it's very much driven by short-term interests. The short-term interest also in science of careers, and from a human perspective, that's understandable. It's the way we are. From a short-term perspective of industry, and also from short-term perspectives of governments, administrations, because they don't want to be left behind or whatever. But as something as complex as starting to meddle in complexities that themselves are hundreds of millions of years old, we should be actually thinking of time frames, even thinking about implementing it, that are maybe 5 to 10 generations. And when you start thinking in those time frames, you understand that it's a huge cultural transition that we need to take these short-term boosters out of technological development, because they're creating so much thrust that we can't handle it. So this needs to be set in a very different framework. And of course, I can't specifically tell you, I can philosophize what that framework might look like, but I see my role here is to say, we need to look a little deeper because there are things at stake that are very important to us. And so, yeah, my answer is complete change in view of technological development, and that means the personal interests of industry or scientists or governments. For instance, their term cycles, what are 4 or 5 years? It's nothing compared to the timeframes we should take into consideration. So what we're really looking at, yes, is a big cultural change, maybe not unlike the one or similar, actually even bigger, than the transition from feudalism to whatever transition we're actually still in. That was also a huge change. And these changes are possible. It's not like we haven't had huge changes in our human history. Does that more or less, you look skeptical.
I'm wondering if by slowing down, getting to these time frames, will not just halt progress altogether. I'm wondering if the interest for technology and the implications can survive for that long before getting forgotten.
But the number of humans that are studying technology in one way or another, science and technology, has also skyrocketed. Would it be so bad if we would go back to levels from 300-400 years ago, at least for a while? I mean, it doesn't have to be, yes, I understand that many people, women and men, like to study something because of their personal interests, because they're excited about it. It gives them a lot. But we have to put these personal interests in perspective with this engine that we've created that we are not dealing well enough with. And that's personal. My personal view is those interests, justifiable, understandable interests, legitimate interests, are less important than the well-being of humanity.
But we are dealing not bad, we are dealing very good with it. you really do you really want to live 150 years ago?
I said that before. I mean, I'm not even talking about 150 years. I'm just saying I would not want to live in a situation that can become very uncomfortable. I agree with that. Who does?
In heaven. I mean, now, taking any point of human history, we live in heaven even with all the problems you talk about.
Yeah.
So what is so wrong about the use of technology till now if we live in heaven?
Yeah, but that's exactly the point. We, and by we, I'm thinking you mean us here or people living in Switzerland. There's enough people in this world that are not living in heaven and that are, for instance, already heavily affected by climate change.
The proportion of those people is tiny compared with the proportion 150 years ago. I mean, you're totally right.
I'm loving this discussion right now. We are kind of running out of time. I would love to have one other exchange, but we need...
Just one quick.
No,
I wrote a book on the topic. It's complimentary. You're most welcome to take a copy with you. There's 3 or 4 in German. The rest are in English.